I've got a story to share before we jump into the gospel stuff. But it's a gospel story, so it works. And I've been trying all morning to anonymize the person who I'm telling the story about. And at the last service, I realized that I've just been using one of his nicknames the whole day. And so this is the recorded service where he could one day hear this one. So I'm going to change his name to Tom. For all of you Thomases out there, sorry. I'm one too. I knew a guy once named Tom. Yeah, there we go. We'll start there. By his own words, he had a long and illustrious career, successful as a self-titled gangbanger and drug dealer. And he would often come to my church in Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida. If you know anything about Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, you might imagine that a self-proclaimed gangbanger and drug dealer might stand out a little bit, and he did. He would often come dressed in these really loud clothes, and he had a grill, a mouthful of gold teeth that was just incredible. But he also stood out all the time because he was loud. He loved people. And he wanted to be in a relationship, so he would stand in the courtyard and greet everyone. And it's Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida. And so some people would gladly welcome the connection, and some people would feel a little bit strange and walk on the other side of the courtyard and try to get to their cars. He is just a great man, and he would say that he had given his life to Christ, and now he's trying to make up for lost time, and that's why he just wants to love on everybody that he can. I don't know what happened in his life that brought him to church, who might have intervened or invited him or helped to get him off the streets, but he started not by going to the Episcopal Church of Ponte Vedra Beach, Florida, but by going to our kind of local megachurch, our equivalent of North Point. Episcopalians are, the frozen chosen, so that's not the place to start with a lot of folks. And he knew he could be anonymous, perhaps, in this larger church and maybe find welcome there. And he did. They got to know him, and he got to know them a little bit, and he started volunteering in ministry. He was part of the parking lot crew. It's a big enough church to have a parking lot ministry. And the ushers also got to know him a little bit. Now, he was homeless and also carless, and so most of the time he'd go to church, and then he'd walk to the bus stop that was nearby the church, and he'd take the buses home. And taking the bus in Jacksonville is a feat. Sometimes, it takes an hour between buses, and if you have to transfer buses to get where you're going, it can take forever. So people saw him kind of suffering, we might say, through that process. One day, Tom was in church, and the ushers kind of gathered around him afterwards and said, "Hey, do you want a ride?" He said, "No, I'm gonna get the bus today." And they said, "No, we want to give you a ride. Come on." And he kept on saying, no, he's perfectly happy to go and pray and wait for his bus and read his Bible and wait and wait and wait. They said, "No, Tom, come on. We want to give you a ride." So we walked with them out into the parking lot. Eventually, they kind of prevailed, and the usher that was encouraging him to receive his ride walked with him out there, and then when they got to the car, passed him the keys and gave him the title to this vehicle and said, "Tom, here's your ride." There were things that happened before that moment, I know, but that was a decisive moment of change in his life. He would live in that car for quite some time. He eventually got a second car while he was living in his first car. But he had the ability to now get a job, get a number of jobs, and drive to those jobs over time. And then by the time I got to know him, he was landing his permanent job, one that he still has. I'll text back and forth with him every now and then, and he's so proud of the work that he does. Overnight, he does a lot of cleaning with different organizations, and he'll text me before and after pictures of the stuff that he is cleaning. He's so proud. It wasn't the nicest car in the world, I can assure you. The individual who gifted it to him didn't invest a whole lot of money, but it was enough. And it changed his life. At least it changed the chapter of his book that was being written at that time. A little intervention, a little seeing of a human being that others sometimes tried to avoid. And everything changed. A different ending of the story. The lesson that we have from Jesus today is a complicated one in many different ways, but it starts off the same way as most of the lessons that we've had recently. a confrontation that Jesus is having with these Pharisees, these teachers of the law that are in conflict with Jesus, primarily about Jesus' sense of value and Jesus' sense of purpose, right? So Jesus keeps on saying, these are my values, and they keep saying, those are not the right ones, and Jesus keeps saying, this is my purpose, this is the way that I'm going on. They keep saying, like, you should be doing this thing, and Jesus is resolute. So these conflicts have been rising, especially about things that are, or people that are isolated or separated or lost. And Jesus keeps saying, I value these people highly, and my purpose is to find them and to bring them back home. He's been confronting the Pharisees and teaching the disciples, and the Pharisees are not getting it so much that around the same time as our teaching today, he will end up saying to them, the things that they value, mostly wealth, is what he points to, are detestable in God's sight. Ooh, you can get that feeling that he's trying to pick a fight here, right? And so he tells this story back to them as a way of showing them that they're valuing the wrong things. A story about this man named Lazarus, and a rich man whose name is not even known. It's erased from history. It's a complicated story. It's got a lot of layers. Lucky for you, I'm planning on being around for a while, and we get this story every 3 years. So I'll come back to some of those other layers some other time. But you can tell how densely packed it is just because there in the name alone, just at the beginning, you have all this meaning. Here's a rich man who you know for sure that everybody in his community knew his name, knew his significance, how important and influential he was. Many of them probably admired him and wanted to be like him. I bet nobody knew the name of the beggar at his gate. But Jesus says that the beggar's name is remembered and the rich man's name is forgotten. That's a densely packed parable right there, right? Just at the beginning. For all of its complexities, though, what strikes me is this invitation to understand how many opportunities the rich man would have had to make a small gesture, a little bit of eyesight, a little acknowledgement and noticing could have changed the outcome of the story for Lazarus and for the rich man for that matter as well. Perhaps instead of Lazarus, this might have been my friend Tom. Perhaps instead of Tom, this is the story of one of the countless neighbors on thin ice that I have ignored or avoided or neglected or just failed to see in my lifetime. There are too many to name, there are too many to count. Some of their faces I remember quite clearly. How did their stories move on from that time? What did that chapter look like? What did the next chapter look like? How did their stories end? And did I recognize myself, and do I now, as having had any authority to make a difference in their lives, to help them write a different ending? That might be a weird way of talking about that. Did I have the authority to intervene? Did I have the authority to help them write a different chapter or a different ending to their story? But it's also a helpful way of talking about it. Over the last couple months, I've asked you to look at all sorts of hoped-for restorations, reconnections with things that are really important. Community and faith and the practices of faith and the environments in which these things are strengthened and healed, right? Like Sabbath and so on and so forth. Over the last couple weeks, I've switched a little bit to see if I could encourage you to think about you personally and we as a church about getting our purpose aligned with Jesus and getting our values aligned with Jesus. And today's the last one of these, and I want to talk to you about getting your authority lined up with Jesus. The authority by which you act in the world, getting that aligned with the heart of Jesus. Authority is a complicated topic. It's another one of those things that I could probably preach about in a lot of different ways. I'll probably come back to this topic as we approach our elections here in another month or so. often a helpful reminder around that time. But today, just one quick reminder before saying more, and that's this, that for Christians, for followers of Jesus, when we talk about authority, our authority for ministry especially, what we are talking about is what we call proximal authority, right? Our authority is derived not from our own willpower or because you're really good or you read the Bible really well or something like that, or because you were given a collar or a license to do ministry. That's not where your authority comes from. Your authority comes from being close to the heart of Jesus. Your proximity to Jesus is where your authority comes from. It's where mine comes from too. It's where ours comes from as a church. It's proximal authority. The way that we might talk about this, certainly the way that the Bible talks about this, is that the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of Jesus is within you and upon you. Not just for you, but for the sake of the world, that you might continue to do the work that Jesus himself was doing. So the closer you get to the heart of Jesus, the more you know Jesus, the greater your sense of offering with authority the ministry that Jesus offered and is offering through you. We've got all sorts of different ways to talk about this, but I see like there are some confused faces and some faces that I think are getting it. I just want to give you an example of how this works in another field so that you can maybe hold on to it. This one would be, I don't know, fewer people would probably argue with this one. And it gives me a chance to trot out a big theological word that I paid like $70,000 in seminary to be able to use. So here's your vocabulary for the day. You have hermeneutical authority. Have you ever heard that word, hermeneutical authority? Right? You have the authority to interpret Scripture for yourself. $70,000 so that I could say interpret in a fancy word. Still paying for it too. All right, you have hermeneutical authority, which means this, that you don't need me to help you interpret Scripture. I hope I help some, but you can do it on your own. Now, does that just mean everybody's opinion is right about everything? Well, not exactly. What we'd say is your authority is still proximal. So the accuracy of your reading Scripture, at least as it relates to God's desire for us, increases the closer you get to the heart of Jesus. The closer you get to Jesus, the more your reading of Scripture, your interpreting of Scripture will be about the things of God instead of the things of Remington or you. It works the same way with your authority to participate in the work of healing, of finding the lost and the suffering, the neglected, the isolated and the separated, and bringing them back in to wholeness. The Spirit of God is working in you and resting on you for that purpose. The closer you get to the heart of Jesus, the more you might know that. The more you might do that purpose we talked about recently, shining that brighter light so that we can find those lost coins and going out there to find those lost sheep and recognizing that there are some lost folks here. Sometimes it's easy to recognize the people like Tom in our lives. They cross some sort of threshold for us. When a person like Tom walks into a church like St. David's, usually somebody's going to come to me in the hallway and kind of tug on my robe and say, "There's a guy here, and he's kind of weird." I'm going to ask you if you asked him his name, and you're probably going to say no, and that's going to be okay. And then I'm going to go, and I'm going to build up the courage to ask him his name and hope that it's not going to be a real weird day. Sometimes it's going to be a weird day. And sometimes, because it crosses that threshold, we can recognize the opportunity for what it is. And sometimes the opportunity is sitting right next to us and has been for a long time, and we don't see it. But the call of Jesus is to see it. And the closer we get to the heart of Jesus, the more our eyes change, the more capable we are of seeing it when it is a chapter filled with grief and loss and isolation and somebody being marginalized or destitute or cast out. And somebody in their hurt, seems unknown to us but known to Jesus, and then we know too. When we do that work and we find out that it's true that somebody's hurting like that, I hope you'll know that you have the authority. I hope we'll know that we have the authority to act on Jesus' behalf. I think you do. I hope we'll hold on to it. I hope we'll draw some motivation from it. I hope that will be true for all of us. Holding on to the values and the purpose and even the authority of Jesus, that's not some kind of get-out-of-hell-free card. It's not how you earn your salvation. Sorry to those of you who are still recovering Roman Catholics in our midst. It's not the way we talk about these things in the Episcopal Church anyway. But it is the case that the closer you get to the heart of Jesus, the more you embrace the authority of Jesus to act in this world on his behalf, the more you align your personal values and your personal purpose with the heart of Jesus. There are some people whose life is a living hell that will get better because you are there to help them write a new story. So I hope we'll all recognize that Spirit working in us and resting upon us to do that work. When Paul, or somebody claiming to be Paul, maybe wrote to Timothy in that letter we have, there was a good line there toward the end that I want to close with because it calls out to us about this work that we have to do on behalf of Jesus and the life that is offered to us, the real life that is offered to us in the doing of the work. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, but you can check it out in your bulletin again if you need to. People of God, be rich in good works, generous, and always ready to share, so that you and those whom you serve might take hold of life that is really life.